You're with Julian on the Brown Note and a review of the fourth album by the band DIIV. DIIV, spelt D-I-I-V, all capitalised, are one of the most prominent of the new wave of shoegaze bands. I guess the new wave of shoegaze and dreampop bands, probably the two biggest would be Beach House and DIIV. Before that, there were groups that parlayed into shoegaze as it sort of became this incredibly potent genre again that it is today, one of the most trendy out there. There's hundreds of shoegaze bands now, but bands like M83 were sort of like dipping their toe back into the water. And then we had the holy trinity of My Bloody Valentine, Slowdive and Ride re-emerge around the midpoint of the last decade to albums and tours. I'm going to see Ride in about a week or so, which is very interesting, and I gave their latest album, Interplay, a stellar review. I think it's a very underappreciated album. Both Beach House and DIIV have something in common with each other in that, I've said this before about the war on drugs, there are bands that reinvent the wheel every time they make an album and come back with a completely different sound, but every time that the war on drugs make an album, it's like they're trying to make the perfect album and refine it. And Beach House have done an amazing job of that, and the DIIV albums, all of which I think I featured on the radio, have been excellent. But Beach House has certainly done that more. There's been more refining to the sound and additions and chances in the music taken, and it's a broader palette, whereas DIIV has this very sort of chimey post-Faith Cure, post-Disintegration Cure attack. It's all quite a similar pace, for better or worse, and a similar sound stage. And there's been quite big gaps between the albums. Ocean in 2012, which was very well received, and then Is Our, terrible title, in 2016. The gaps are usually down to the personal problems of the band, led by Zachary Cole Smith, involving the law, involving drugs, involving rehab, involving infighting, and that happened again with this one. Between Deceiver in 2019 and this album, Frog in Boiling Water, there was a 5-year gap where the band fell apart and put themselves back together again, and there was all the usual stuff going on. Their music has always sort of focused internally on the internal process of the mind, but this one is a much more outward-looking album lyrically, which is interesting. And it seems to focus particularly on sort of capitalism and dystopia and the current state of the world, not from a positive perspective. The opener sets tonally and musically the scene, as virtually all the tracks do share that same soundstage in amber. One thing that they are very good at is they will try and pack a lot of detail into songs. I really had a problem with that last Slowdive album in that they were just fragments and they didn't go anywhere, but at least all of the songs on this album are fully developed, more or less. And they have enough musical elements in there, and they definitely are trying to sculpt albums when they make releases. In Amber, the opener, it's very low slung, very comfortable sounding. It sort of kicks off as though you're already halfway through the album, and there's a definite 90s alt rock vibe going on with some of this sound, and there's a great crunchy guitar riff that erupts at the halfway stage. It is then sort of in the dream pop Beach House lane, with a I Want to Disappear as the lyrical motif. We get a proper glistening Slowdive-esque guitar line for the second track, Brown Paper Bag, and a lovely My Bloody Valentine guitar motif at the end. We're just fodder for the army op. Reminds me lyrically, this album quite a bit of Ride's Interplay. Ride were never political in their early half of their career, but particularly Mark Gardner, one of the twin songwriters, has continually focused on things like capitalism and the global affairs in modern ride music, particularly on Interplay. So it's interesting that they've both gone down this same route. One interesting fact as well is it's almost as though DIIV, who were obviously influenced by the original shoegaze heroes, have been copied a little bit musically by Ride. I think Ride are big fans of DIIV, and certain elements to the way they use guitars now seems very adjacent to what DIIV are doing. Raining on Your Pillow, track 3. I think that's where the We're Not Just Fodder for the Army Op came. Vaguely menacing sound on that one. 4, again, the title track has that disintegration sort of era Cure riff where it's going, it starts descending. History Begins Right Now With You and Me could be a positive, but it's preceded by Burn the Books, Don't You See? Saying the music's samey is a bit redundant as an artist that does that a lot. But when I say the music is samey in Beach House, you look at that last album they did, there was so much more ground covered. And even when they're refining their albums, they've added so many nuances to the music that you can definitely tell the albums apart. I don't know that that's the case so much with DIIV. Track 5, Everyone's Out, has a really exciting and dramatic sort of motif to open it, but it never really lives up to the drama. It just sort of, it sounds like it's going to build up to something that's going to erupt, and it just drifts along, which is a shame. Track 6, referencing another of the modern era shoegaze legends, the new legends, Paranol from South Korea, whose 2 major albums have been absolutely superb. Nice crunchy riffs and a guitar wash on it that really made me think of the South Korean anonymous artist Paranol. But it isn't really very urgent. There's not much urgency to any of the tracks. It gets a lot better sort of the last few tracks. Somber Is the Drums, I think, is my favourite. It's a more arresting song melodically and dramatically, arguably the best track. But then Little Birds is again quite drifty, and the musical elements are reused on virtually every song, which is a little bit of burnout for me. Definitely slow dive again on the penultimate track, Soulnet. And then one of the stronger tracks, Fender on the Freeway, is a longer form track. A bit more modulation, a bit more variety in what's being offered musically. It's got a claim. I struggle with how samey it is. I do think it's better than that Slow Dive album I gave a terrible review to last year. Primarily because they obviously spend so much time on each song. They actually do spend an awful lot of time. I just wish that they'd mix up the pace, the soundstage, what instruments are in each song, the sound of each instrument in each song, which is often the same across multiple tracks. So it gets all a bit dull for me, I'm afraid. So I'm not going to say that I thought it was a particularly good album I'd go back to. I think it's a very well made one that's interesting at times and is pleasant to listen to, but I'm only going to give Frog in Boiling Water a 6 out of 10.